the cause and origin of the creation. The incidents which happened in the kingdom of the spirits were the cause of the origin of the creation, that is, the entire universe including all of its creations of the spiritual and the material kind. Prior to the originating of these creations was nothing but the spiritual kingdom. It was a condition of immense blissfulness within which spiritual beings enjoyed themselves of their existence and, by their possession of power and light, were able to create, according to their destiny. And again, this creating consisted in spiritual creations, that is the thoughts and ideas that emanated from God towards those beings which they thus converted by immense bliss into reality, because the power to do so was at their disposal and they were also capable of using their will, in a free manner. And there was no need for this blissful condition of the spirit beings to be changed, ever, and as long as their love for their Creator remained unchanged within them and they thus were being saturated with the divine light of love, they didn't need to fear neither restriction of their power nor a reduction of their light. But then, the condition occurred when a new view opened up to the beings when, on the part of the first created being, the light carrier Lucifer, the divinity, God, was presented to be doubtful because it was not visible, that is as a visible being, when he, Lucifer, himself pretended to be the one from whom all the spirit beings emerged and he thus expected from them the acknowledgement of being their God and Creator instead. Hence, the beings were thus put into a conflict because their love belonged to the one who created them. But Lucifer's presentation confused them. In fact, it appeared more plausible since Lucifer was shining in light and radiance and a being above him they certainly could not imagine. Except, though, there still remained the light of insight within them according to which they also held doubts against Lucifer's presentation. But by now clear moments started to take turns with slightly dull ones, and the more the being devoted itself to the latter ones, the longer the phases of darkened thinking became. With other words, the one's thoughts became clear and the being most clearly recognized its origin. And, thus, Lucifer was not able to dull the insight of the latter anymore. The former, however, got under his control quite quickly and followed him and considered him as their God and Creator because they rejected their enlightened moments which repeatedly occurred to them as well, prior to the taking place of the final fall into the abyss. The undiminished power of Lucifer at the beginning had created a numberless army of most blissful spirit beings, and from this abundance of his creation a wrong self-consciousness grew within him. He did not see the source any more from which he had obtained that power, but he only considered the proofs of the power which had flowed through him, and all this he wanted to keep just for himself even though he knew it equally belonged to the one from the power of whom he was allowed to draw. Yet, he also wanted not only to possess it but also to dull the light in these beings which most distinctly revealed their origin to them. And he thus managed them to be caught in a conflict which also lessened their blissfulness and hampered their creative activity, until they made a final decision for their Lord and, by that, the beings and the light carrier as well forfeited their power with the light and plunged into the darkness. And that one spiritual event, which can only be explained to you humans in broad outlines, was the cause for the coming into existence of the endless creations of the spiritual and the material kind. These creations are nothing but a transformed, broken away spiritual. By this breakaway from God, which is an endless remote distance, it became continuously harder in its substance the farther it fell. Now, this must be understood like this: the spiritual power from God, which drives for a continuously livelier activity, was not able to touch this spiritual anymore because it was fighting against the Spirit of God, and thus, its activity came to an end, the mobility, the life came to a stop. And the remainder was completely solidified substance, actually power originally emanating from God, now having become completely ineffective. But God's love and wisdom had originally destined another purpose to the spiritual, constant activity according to His will, which, at the same time though, was also meant to be the will of the being itself. The spiritual beings had violated against their assignment. They wanted to use their power with an intention opposed to the will of God, but they were not able anymore. Due to their breaking away, they deprived themselves of their power. By now God's love again took a hold of the completely solidified spiritual that did not recognize itself anymore, which was just a conglomeration of contrary to God's spiritual substances. God's power of love dispersed these substances and let the most versatile works of creation rise from them. He thus reshaped the power once emanated from Him, so to speak. He established the destination for every single work of creation that was now certainly achieved in the law of fixed regulation, to the extent of a now forced activity of the disintegrated spiritual, even though without any self-awareness of which it was in possession as a spiritual being once before. Basically, then, the creations are nothing else but that which has originally taken its beginning as a being from God, except in a completely changed condition as far as its perfection is concerned. For all creations are or contain only an imperfect spiritual that is on the path of return to God. The perfect spiritual beings were in no need of material creations. They brought forth their ideas and thoughts from out of themselves, but, again, those were actually just spiritual creations of their own wants and thinking and of their unlimited power. It was a world within which there was certainly nothing found but a perfect. There were no flaws, no limits and no inadequacies, for these did not emerge until the universe contained disloyal to God beings who, being imperfect, needed shells within which they were forced to activity. Hence, then, wherever there are any kind of forms there is also an imperfect spiritual captivated within, and the more solid those forms are, the more hardened and opposed to God is the spiritual bound in it. But even the form itself, matter, consists of such imperfect substances, merely held together by God's power of love to serve the one purpose, as carriers of spiritual beings to help these towards the climb. Divine power of love surrounds all of these spiritual substances, but it does not act forcefully upon them to the point where it would break their resistance by force. Nevertheless, it is true, the work of creation has to, according to the will of God, carry out a certain activity, but the spiritual, contained within, is not being forced to turn to God. And that's why it is also possible the spiritual that belongs to a primal being covers the whole walk through the works of creation up to the last embodiment as a human being, and still, it has not given up its resistance towards God because it is its free will that needs to achieve such, leaving also the possibility for it to again turn to the Lord of Darkness as well. But the continuous activity in the law of fixed regulation mostly accomplishes a decreasing of the resistance against God, because the spiritual, in matter, does sense a certain pleasant feeling even at the slightest self-initiated activity, since a certain application of power fits its original being. The countless star worlds, that is all the creations contained in them, are the result of that one falling away, once, in the realm of the spirits. They will still remain for eternities. There will continuously arise new creations for the sake of making it possible for all the fallen ones to return to God. Eternities will pass by until the work of return will be completed, until even the last solidified spiritual will be dissolved and be able to enter the path of return. But once all those creations will be spiritualized, once again there will be but one spiritual world where all the spiritual will be active with the same will of, and with God, and will be incomparably blissful. Once God will have reached the aim to be surrounded not just by creatures but, rather, by children to whom he can give the greatest blissfulness, because his endless love urges him to constant happiness and also does not let him rest before he has reached his aim. Amen.